Slavery was never the engine of progress it is sometimes portrayed to be. It was not a necessary foundation of modern civilization, nor a tragic shortcut toward development. It was a system of extreme exploitation designed to concentrate wealth, normalize cruelty, and strip millions of people of their humanity. And yet, generations later, many still accept comforting myths that soften its reality. For centuries, enslaved men, women, and children were forced to work under violence and fear, not to uplift societies, but to enrich a small and powerful elite. Entire economies were built on stolen labor. While innovation, education, and freedom were deliberately denied to those at the bottom, the scars of that system did not disappear when laws changed. They embedded themselves into social structures, wealth gaps, and cultural narratives that still shape our world today. But here's the problem. When history is simplified, it becomes dangerous. When exploitation is reframed as necessity, injustice starts to feel inevitable. And when lies are repeated often enough, they begin to sound like truth. In this video, we are going to challenge those lies, not to provoke guilt but to restore clarity. Because understanding slavery as it truly was is essential to understanding the world as it is now. This is not about rewriting history. It is about refusing to look away from it. If you care about honest history, critical thinking, and stories that go deeper than surface-level explanations, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more in-depth, fact-based content like this to a wider audience. Stay with us because what you are about to hear may challenge what you thought you knew. And sometimes, the truth begins exactly there, as we begin to strip away the myths that have softened the history of slavery. One story is often raised as a counter-argument, presented as if it overturns everything we think we know. It is the story of Anthony Johnson, a black man in early colonial America who legally owned enslaved people. On the surface, this fact is sometimes used to suggest that slavery was not fundamentally racial, or that responsibility was evenly shared, but when placed back into its historical setting, Johnson's life reveals something far more unsettling, not about individual guilt, but about the power of systems designed to survive regardless of who stands inside them. Anthony Johnson arrived in Virginia in the early 17th century as an African captive, forced into labor in a world that was still defining the boundaries of freedom and servitude. At that time, the English colonies had not yet fully codified racial slavery. Many laborers, European and African alike, were bound by contracts of indenture. Harsh and unequal though they were, survival in this environment required adaptation. And Johnson, through years of labor, legal maneuvering, and persistence, eventually gained his freedom. He acquired land, raised a family, and entered a colonial society where ownership of property, of labor, of people was the primary measure of security and status. But Johnson's story does not unfold in a moral vacuum. The legal system that governed his life was not African in origin, nor was it shaped by his values or traditions. It was built by European colonial authorities whose courts, laws, and economic incentives were steadily transforming human bondage into something permanent, inheritable, and racial. When Johnson went to court to claim lifetime ownership over another African man, the ruling did not simply reflect a personal dispute. It marked a turning point, one where colonial law confirmed that a black person could be held as property for life, regardless of prior agreements or shared origin. That decision did not empower black people as a group. It strengthened a legal framework that would soon strip freedom from millions. The system did not care who initiated a claim, only that the precedent served its long-term function. By the end of the 17th century, colonial statutes made it clear that African descent itself was becoming a condition of permanent enslavement, passed from parent to child, enforced by violence and upheld by law. Seen this way, Anthony Johnson's story aligns with the broader truth we have already uncovered. Slavery endured not because of individual choices alone, but because it was embedded in institutions designed to reward participation and punish resistance. Johnson's actions did not create racial slavery. They occurred within a structure already moving decisively in that direction. His experience shows how systems of exploitation can compel even the formerly oppressed to conform, not out of malice, but out of survival in a world where security depended on compliance with unjust rules. This is why focusing on exceptional cases can be misleading. They distract from the larger machinery at work. The rise of chattel slavery was not an accident, nor the product of isolated decisions. It was the result of deliberate legal engineering that transformed labor into property and people into commodities. Once that machinery was in place, it did not require moral justification to operate. It required only precedent, repetition, and silence. Understanding this story does not dilute responsibility. It clarifies it. Slavery was never a shared moral failure evenly distributed across humanity. It was a system constructed, refined, and defended by law, economics, and power, capable of absorbing anyone willing or forced to operate within its boundaries. And that is precisely why its legacy did not vanish when individual lives ended, but continued to shape the world long after. As the story continues to unfold, another argument often surfaces, one that appears reasonable on the surface yet quietly distorts the past. It is the claim that slavery in the Americas cannot be fully condemned because slavery already existed in Africa long before Europeans arrived. Like the earlier myths we have examined, this idea relies on removing history from its context and flattening vastly different realities into a single, misleading comparison. When those differences are restored, the narrative changes entirely. Long before European ships appeared on the West African coast, various African societies practiced forms of servitude shaped by local customs, warfare, and social obligation. These systems were neither uniform nor fixed. In many cases, captives were absorbed into households, assigned specific duties, and eventually granted paths toward integration. Status was not permanently sealed by birth, and identity was not defined by skin color alone. Servitude functioned within social frameworks that recognized kinship, community, and human belonging, even when hierarchy and coercion were present. Everything shifted when European demand entered the equation. The transatlantic trade did not simply expand existing practices. It transformed them into something entirely new. European powers brought with them a commercial logic that treated human beings as units of exchange in a global market. People were no longer bound by circumstance or conflict alone, but by a rigid classification that reduced identity to race. African ancestry itself became the justification for lifelong captivity, enforced not by tradition, but by contracts, shipping manifests, and colonial law. This transformation was not accidental. The scale of European demand required consistency, permanence, and predictability. To meet it, systems of enslavement were redesigned to ensure that those captured could never reclaim freedom, and that their children would inherit the same fate. Violence became routine, not as punishment alone, but as a method of control. Families were separated not as a consequence of war, but as policy. Labor was extracted not to sustain a community, but to maximize profit across oceans. The journey across the Atlantic symbolized this rupture. Packed into ships designed for cargo rather than life, captives were stripped of language, names, and social survival itself became uncertain. Those who endured the crossing entered societies where law recognized them not as people with rights or obligations, but as property. Their existence was measured in output, their resistance met with calculated force, their humanity denied by legal definition. By the time this system reached maturity, it bore little resemblance to any earlier form of servitude practiced in Africa. It was racialized, meaning that skin color alone determined status. It was hereditary, ensuring that bondage reproduced itself without interruption. It was industrial in scale, spanning continents and feeding emerging global economies. And it was uniquely brutal, not only in its physical violence, but in its deliberate erasure of identity, history, and belonging. Linking this reality back to the stories already told, a pattern becomes clear. Just as colonial law transformed individual disputes into permanent precedents, European involvement transformed localized practices into a global structure of exploitation. The system did not arise from cultural inevitability. It was engineered, refined, and defended because it was profitable and powerful. When these distinctions are ignored, responsibility becomes blurred and suffering becomes abstract. But when the full context is restored, the truth stands uncomfortably clear. What emerged in the Atlantic world was not a continuation of old traditions, but the creation of a new and devastating order, one whose consequences would echo far beyond the centuries that gave it life. When the Civil War came to an end, the word freedom entered the American story with unprecedented force. On paper, slavery was abolished, chains were broken by law, and a new chapter appeared to begin. Yet history rarely changes course so cleanly, as with the systems we have already examined. The machinery of exploitation did not disappear when the rules were rewritten. It adapted, reshaped itself, and continued to operate beneath a different name. In the years following the war, the South lay economically devastated and politically unsettled. The plantation system that had relied on enslaved labor faced collapse, and those who had once controlled it searched urgently for a replacement. The solution emerged quietly through legislation rather than open defiance. New laws criminalized everyday behaviors, granting local authorities sweeping power to arrest, fine, and imprison newly freed black citizens. These offenses were often vague, unevenly enforced, and impossible to avoid in a society still structured to deny opportunity. Once arrested, those convicted entered a system known as convict leasing. Prisoners were rented out to private businesses, plantations, railroads, and mines as a source of labor that was cheap, expendable, and legally controlled. Unlike enslaved people before them, these workers were not long-term investments. They could be replaced easily, which removed any incentive for care or restraint. Conditions were often harsher than those endured under slavery, with extreme workloads, minimal food, and little protection from injury or illness. This continuation of forced labor fit seamlessly into the pattern already established by earlier systems. As colonial law had once transformed servitude into permanent bondage, post-war legislation now converted freedom into vulnerability. The legal framework did not openly declare a return to slavery, but its outcomes closely mirrored the past. Labor was coerced, mobility was restricted, and punishment enforced obedience. The difference lay not in experience, but in appearance. One of the most striking examples of this transformation unfolded in Louisiana, where former plantations were converted into prison labor camps. Men sentenced for minor or fabricated offenses were sent to work the same land their ancestors had once been forced to cultivate. The names had changed, but the power dynamics remained intact. Freedom existed in theory, while control persisted in practice. This system extended well into the 20th century, shaping generations of lives. Families were separated once again, not but by incarceration. Communities were destabilized through cycles of arrest and forced labor, ensuring that economic independence remained out of reach. The promise of emancipation was continually postponed by mechanisms that punished existence rather than wrongdoing. Linking this chapter to those that came before reveals a consistent truth. Slavery was never sustained by violence alone. It relied on law, economics, and social acceptance to endure. When one form became unacceptable, another emerged to take its place. The end of the Civil War marked a legal turning point, but it did not dismantle the deeper structures that had normalized exploitation for centuries. Understanding this continuity is essential, not to diminish the significance of abolition, but to recognize its limits. Freedom granted without protection is fragile. Rights declared without enforcement are easily undermined. The legacy of slavery did not vanish with surrender or amendment. It lingered through systems that preserved control while avoiding the language of bondage. In tracing this progression, a broader lesson emerges. History does not repeat itself through identical events, but through familiar patterns, and unless those patterns are recognized, named, and confronted, they continue to shape the present long after the moment they are believed to have ended. As the story widens, another comforting illusion begins to fracture the belief that slavery was a regional problem, confined neatly to southern plantations and upheld almost exclusively by powerful men. This version of the past offers a sense of moral distance, suggesting that responsibility rested in one place, among one group, and ended when the borders changed. But the reality was far more entangled, and far more revealing about how deeply slavery was woven into the fabric of American society. While enslaved labor was most visible in the fields of the South, its reach extended far beyond plantation fences. Northern cities thrived on industries that depended directly on enslaved production. Cotton picked by forced labor fueled textile mills in New England. Sugar and tobacco enriched merchants, insurers, and financiers in ports like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. Ships built in the North transported goods grown by enslaved hands, and banks extended credit to plantation owners whose wealth was measured in human property. Slavery did not stop at the Mason-Dixon line. It circulated through contracts, cargo holds, and account books. In these urban centers, slavery often appeared distant, abstracted into numbers and profits. This distance made participation easier. One could condemn the brutality of plantation life while quietly benefiting from its output. Northern prosperity, celebrated as the result of industry and innovation, rested in part on a foundation laid by coerced labor elsewhere. The system endured not because everyone wielded a whip, but because many accepted the rewards without questioning their source. The story grows even more complex when gender enters the frame. For generations, women were portrayed as passive observers of slavery, confined to domestic roles and excluded from real power. Yet within a society where property defined status, ownership of enslaved people offered women a means of authority otherwise denied to them. Through inheritance, marriage, and business transactions, many women became slaveholders in their own right. They managed estates, negotiated sales, enforced discipline, and defended their economic interests with determination. Some recorded their thoughts in letters and diaries, acknowledging the cruelty of the system while continuing to benefit from it. Others openly justified slavery as necessary or divinely sanctioned. Their participation was not incidental. It was deliberate, structured, and supported by the same legal protections that upheld male ownership. Slavery offered women influence within a patriarchal world, binding their personal advancement to the maintenance of human bondage. This dual expansion across regions and across gender reveals a deeper truth about how systems of exploitation endure. Slavery was not sustained by a single group acting in isolation. It required cooperation, silence, and normalization at every level of society. The plantation relied on the factory, the port, the bank, and the household. Each link made the next possible, and each participant could claim distance from the worst violence while remaining part of the chain. Placed alongside earlier chapters in this story, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Just as colonial law transformed servitude into permanent bondage, and post-war legislation reshaped slavery into incarceration, social narratives narrowed responsibility to preserve comfort. By locating slavery only in the South or only among men, the nation constructed a simplified memory that obscured widespread complicity. Recognizing this does not flatten moral distinctions or deny acts of resistance. It sharpens understanding. Slavery functioned not as a regional anomaly, but as a national enterprise. It thrived not because of individual cruelty alone, but because it aligned with economic ambition and social order across boundaries of geography and gender. When these connections are restored, the past becomes harder to compartmentalize and harder to dismiss. Slavery was not the burden of one region or one group. It was a shared system, sustained by many hands, and its legacy cannot be fully understood without acknowledging how far and how deeply it reached. As we reach the conclusion of this exploration, it becomes clear that the history of slavery is far more complex than the simplified stories we often hear, and its legacy stretches far beyond the textbooks. Many people assume that Christianity universally opposed slavery, that Europeans merely purchased slaves rather than facilitating their capture, and that slavery ended long ago with no ongoing consequences. But these assumptions obscure the deeper truths. In reality, religious institutions and figures were sometimes complicit, providing theological justification for the exploitation of human beings, while European demand and involvement intensified conflicts and systems that allowed slavery to flourish on a massive scale. These myths paint a comforting picture of the past, but the historical record reveals a far darker, more tangled story. Understanding the past also means recognizing its echoes in the present. Modern slavery is not merely a relic of history. It remains a pressing global issue, affecting an estimated 40 million people worldwide. Human trafficking, forced labor in industries ranging from agriculture to manufacturing, and coercive domestic servitude continue to mirror many of the mechanisms of control, violence, and dehumanization that characterized historic slavery. By acknowledging this, we confront a sobering truth. The fight for human dignity and equality is ongoing, and the work of dismantling systems of exploitation requires vigilance, awareness, and action from all of us. History teaches us that slavery was not an isolated or inevitable phenomenon, but a system deliberately constructed to enrich a few at the cost of millions. The myths we have examined about who owned slaves, where slavery existed, and who was complicit often serve to obscure the real human suffering and the systemic injustice at the heart of the institution. By challenging these myths and confronting the evidence, we honor the memory of those who endured unimaginable hardship and recognize the resilience, courage, and humanity of those who resisted. As we reflect on these truths, it is essential to recognize our role in keeping history accurate and in striving for a more just world. Knowledge is a powerful tool. Sharing it, questioning convenient narratives, and supporting efforts to protect human rights are ways we can contribute to meaningful change. Let this story serve not only as a record of injustice, but also as a call to empathy, responsibility, and action. Thank you for taking the time to learn and reflect on these difficult but necessary truths. If you found this exploration insightful, please consider supporting the channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing this video so that more people can engage with the realities of history and its enduring impact. Together, we can ensure that the lessons of the past continue to shape a fairer, more conscious world.